So, hi, welcome to the next video in this series of Make It Your Own. We're looking in this session at lessons 9 and 10 from Paws B, and I'm joined this week by Chalwin, who many of you will know from his extensive work with the Mindfulness in Schools project, both as a trainer and also as head of education here for a very long time. And very recently, Ben has returned to schools and is working as a head teacher in a primary school in Cornwall. So it would be really lovely to hear a little bit about what that was like, that transition from working for MISP to going back in schools again. And also really interesting to hear a bit about how you've begun to introduce mindfulness in your setting.
Yeah, so to give a little bit of context, I've been out of leadership since 2015 when I switched to teaching part-time and then teaching MISP's curricula freelance, teaching MBSR freelance. And then I think I joined MISP initially in 2017 and then became full-time in 2018. So it'd been 7 to 10 years out of being based full-time in a school. Made the decision last year that I quite fancy being back in a physical community with actual young children. Much as I enjoyed teaching adults as if they were children on training, it's pertinent to get back into school. So I actually finished working for MISP at the end of last August in 2025 and then started as a head teacher on the 1st of September. So it was quite a quick transition. The school that I'm in, we're a very small coastal rural school. So the maximum size of the school is 42 in terms of children. I think it's 38 at the moment. And around the size of the school, I'm in the unusual position that I'm a part-time head teacher. Well, actually full-time role psychologically, but part-time in terms of being on the actual site and in the building. So we have two classes, reception year 1, year 2, and then a years 3 to 6 class. So initially it was very much a period of settling into the school, getting to know everybody, getting to know the children, the staff, the parents, the families, the local community. And I'd resolved not to change anything too quickly, but also quite keen to bring mindfulness in, as I had quite heavily sold that during the interview process anyway, and it was something that the governors and the interviewing panel were very keen on. So deliberately didn't do anything really in the autumn term, and I think it was towards the end of spring that we started with Paws B in the Key Stage 2 classroom. Not with the whole class, but with years 3, 4 and 5. So one hidden agenda there was to give the teacher time to focus in on year 6s in terms of preparation for SATs. So yeah, taking the subsection years 3, 4 and 5 and starting Paws B, and actually it got up to lesson 10 by the end of this week. So the timing of this chat is quite pertinent. So yeah, I can talk about introducing it to those children. Despite creating dots, I haven't played with that yet in reception year 2. That'll be coming. But yeah, happy to talk about Paws and what it's like to introduce it pretty cold. To give a little bit of context as well, the school has a PSHE curriculum that has aspects of mindfulness within it, but this was really the first teaching something a bit more discreet and boundary, with mindfulness very much at its heart.
I'd be really interested to know what it's like teaching year 3, 4 and 5 together. I've taught 3 and 4 together and 4 and 5 together and 5 and 6 together separately because I've worked in quite a few rural schools in this area. But what's it like having 3 year groups together?
Yeah, so I can talk about that and having 4 because I do teach them in PPA separately. Hats off to the class teacher, particularly when it comes to maths and English, for being able to juggle the curricula within that. For me, so the class is only 21 anyway if it was full. So take 7 away from that, and we've actually got quite a small group of children to work with. So developmentally, I sometimes wonder whether the span across 4-year groups is similar to what we might get within a class as 1 or 2-year groups in terms of where people are in their learning. In terms of Paws B, there's probably a degree of separation between the kind of readiness to learn mindfulness and probably the depth of personal maturity that we might bring to the different lessons. And that probably becomes more prevalent in these latter sessions as well, particularly this one. So I would say there is a variety of degrees of buy-in to what's being shared within the lesson, and possibly also a slight shift in focus over which bits of the lessons resonate the most. So the classic fight, flight, freeze videos from the younger members of that class, they would quite happily watch those every week on repeat. And it was interesting, particularly during lesson 9, how some of that resonated perhaps more with some of the year 5 pupils. But in terms of participating in the sessions, everyone's participating, everybody's contributing, but they're doing it at their own level, which is pretty much what we'd expect with any group of children.
Yeah, yeah. It's a differentiation by outcome, I suppose, is what
Yeah,
we see. We talk a lot, don't we, about, or have done on training, about sowing seeds and seeing what lands with children. And sometimes something does, and I know that you're going to mention this shortly when we get on to talking about the lessons. And it's just knowing it's okay to just light touch that and move on, and know that at some point in time you might revisit it, perhaps when they're more able to understand in more depth or detail what you're referring to.
yeah. And I think also, actually, to put this into context again, this is the first time that any of them have come across Paws B. So there's not even that cultural familiarity within the school.
Yeah.
So discussing why the characters look the way they do has taken up a fair amount of time in some of the sessions. That's dropped a bit now. So rather than these images being familiar within the school community, it's all quite fresh.
What's making me smile about that is knowing that you were involved in the design process
Yeah,
for
yeah,
Paws B. So some of those choices would have been yours.
yeah. And quite a few of them are based on my own facial expressions or photographs of me. So yeah, it is quite funny. It's also interesting because you think, actually, why did we do that? Or why did the artist create things in a certain way?
I like that. It's nice that you've got that kind of personal input into this curriculum specifically. And I guess I know you're not currently teaching docs, but when you come to deliver docs as well in the school, it'll be the same in terms of choices and
Yeah.
it's
Although
like,
although I do think we forget as much as we remember about why we made some of these choices.
hmm,
I suspect every teacher, when they look back through their lesson plans from previous years, go, why did I do that? What was that all about? But actually, in the context of Paws B, it's interesting because normally as a teacher, you do find your own. Well, it's a bit like having a recipe and you adjust the ingredients according to the taste of whoever you're feeding. Whereas when you're creating something like Paws B, you're trying to create something that was one size fits all. So this greater permission to adapt from MISP, I think, is very welcomed, even though I suspect most teachers have done that themselves over time anyway.
yeah, absolutely. To some extent, like you just said, you automatically do it, don't you? Changing the way that you describe things, language that you use, etc. Just happens when you've got certain students in front of you.
Yeah, although I do think these are some of the few materials that I've probably delivered as they're written compared to most math schemes, for instance.
Yeah, I understand that completely. So let's move on then to just exploring lesson 9 a little bit. And
Yeah,
you were saying that sometimes this lesson takes a bit longer than some of the others.
yeah. So this one in particular, I think I often allow an hour for,
Uh-huh.
whereas lesson 10 slightly shorter, I think, but I did probably take about 45 minutes on that this week. Just to give context, I have complete freedom as to how much of the afternoon to use that because we had some other things to do. So I'm probably not quite as boundaried as maybe other people are timetable wise, but I certainly think it's prudent to allow longer than you might normally, particularly for lesson 9. And for me, I don't know about anybody else, but when I initially did an MBSR course, when I wasn't motivated by teaching, it was done out of personal interest, but the whole thoughts are not necessarily facts piece really resonated with me. So I'm probably also bringing a personal interest to this. But also, I think it's often the first time that young people have ever been explored what thoughts might be. So it seems a good use of time to give more time to this.
And which of the sections would you say that so if you are giving more time, where is the time being taken up?
It's interesting that once you get over the initial title slide, that it opens with a FOF box, and then the guidance is anything from 3 to 10 minutes, which is a very different experience. So generally, I try and give a longer FOF box immediately with a bit more space. And I think it was pushing the 10-minute mark last week. So that in itself, if you've only got 30 minutes assigned, is a pretty big chunk but I quite like the grounding and the settling that comes from that. And it's often for me, particularly with the perhaps the younger round, that this is the first point that actually they do start to settle a little bit more, or at least have the massive personal realization that if you look at somebody else, you probably are more likely to giggle. Making a little bit choices around that. So I generally start with a longer FOF go over the kind of recap of the different bits of the brain that we look at fairly quickly. Generally, then have some questions about the parts of the brain that we're not looking at, no matter how many times you say we're not looking at those parts of the brain. But then that slide of the character with the question mark about what are thoughts, we spend quite a lot of time on. And there were some big realizations this week about not everybody having an inner monologue. I mean, that came as a real shock to some people who quite clearly have a monologue that is going constantly. And a really looks of bafflement and surprise over some people only maybe seeing still images or being able to see moving images or actually not being able to visualize things at all. And quite a philosophical discussion around what thoughts are and what they might be for different people. I like that, the whole similarities and differences is within that. So even as a kind of non-explicit intention, that awareness that we're not all the same, even though we have commonalities. And perhaps for those children who are at the more at the worrying end of the spectrum and have quite repetitive thoughts, it was interesting for them to hear, even before we started to talk about ways to work with that, that actually not everybody is like that. So again, it brings a greater possibility of change. So being happy to give that time to really discuss it fully, I think is helpful.
Yeah, and I agree, but have found it harder just in the sense that a lot of my teaching of Paul's B has been as a peripatetic teacher, where I've said it's 45 minutes. So sometimes I felt the time pressure with this particular discussion.
Yeah.
But I agree, if you can give it the time, give it the time, because it's so valuable for all of those reasons that you've just named.
I do have methods for clawing the time back later on.
Oh.
So I've worked both within my own schools on this, and also, so when I first got employed to basically revamp Paul's B, I was still a class teacher, which was great fun. We've been able to play around with the images and the structure and things. So this was co-created by my class at the time, I think.
Oh.
But even going in as an external teacher, which I was doing at the same time, I did have ways of being able to pull back time if I was slightly behind. So I may not have given as long for a FOFBot if I had a more defined period of time, but I would still personally give that what are thoughts. Because actually we get into circular definitions of describing what are thoughts in terms of thinking, and then actually trying to get people to describe what that's like is quite a light bulb moment anyway, because we're used to our way of thinking, whatever that might be. It's quite habitual. Have we ever questioned that? And I think for a lot of young people, it might be the first time. The same for a lot of adults, whether it's in Dot Beginner, MBSR, or MBCT. It's often a moment of, oh, okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Real penny dropping can happen. And I think giving young people a kind of experience of that by inviting it through a practice where they're encouraged to notice how they experience their thoughts is really helpful.
Yeah.
And I think there's just, like you said, a real celebration of difference, as well as the things we might have in common with other people here.
No, I was going to say, actually, when you said that, because I did do my normal thing of just saying a random sequence of words. And it was interesting who within the class was happy just to spend the moment with that word and who needed to tie it to a narrative and make sense of it, even at that stage. So we did, I'm glad you said that because it's jogged my own memory. We did have a discussion around how quickly we do try and make a story around things or make sense of it, which obviously sets up what's coming.
Yeah.
And also, it already got onto the minds making things up because people had very different narratives anyway.
Yeah, that's good to hear. So you just mentioned that about setting up the next bit of the lesson. Is that something that you spend much time on?
I went through the we all worry slide reasonably quickly, apart from making it clear that the mind tells stories and fills in the gaps, which you'd already experienced. I was also doing a quite light touch due to the anxiety levels of some members of the class. So that was a little bit of awareness about those who I were working with and not to push it too much. The same when we come back onto that, what do we tend to worry about later on? That was a really light touch. because never mind the exposing the soft underbelly, that soft underbelly was quite prominent anyway. So I made a decision last time I taught that to move through it quickly. And generally for me, that's a passing slide.
Mm.
Sam's story I took because they were quite unsettled on the back of talking about thoughts. Everybody went into their own space bubble as I read through the story, even though you saw the like eyes going on. And then we came back and they spoke about it with people near them before we came back into the whole group. And it was all the normal things that came out. Although interestingly, they were less concerned about kind of gender, which was interesting. They were more baffled by age changing and the classic, well, what on earth are they doing in the swimming competition? So that was the loosening bit. And we've all seen differently and we're making mind things up. Our mind makes things up, fills in the gaps. The old video resonated, but it didn't cause that much discussion. Although we did go into a side discussion around that sometimes it is helpful to worry on the back of that, particularly in terms of motivation levels, but not worrying about, but the worrying for the sake of it is not that helpful to us and how it can grow. They're all baffled by the having a car as your outcome.
Oh.
Yep. So.
I think that's a really good distinction to make, actually, about because it's like the discussions about stress, isn't it?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
a little bit of stress is not a bad thing because it does get us going, does motivate us, and it's similar with worry. It's just recognizing when it's not productive or constructive.
Yeah, if you're walking on a coast path and with children, you ideally want them to be a little bit concerned about the possibility of falling over the edge.
Yeah,
You don't want them to be so concerned that they spent the night before awake worrying about it, or even afterwards spent the rest of the day looping over the what if I had fallen off.
Yeah, so to not have any awareness of risk is an issue, but to be completely risk averse is not great.
It can become a bit of a barrier for doing anything.
So yeah, it is the balance of things. And
But,
so did that come into play in terms of the snowballing, discussing
so
that?
pre the snowballing, what came out particularly strongly from one individual was about what if thinking. So even out of that video, which they're interested in because it is quite antiquated, which I think has a strength to it in terms of the degree of unfamiliarity. I mean, never mind the guy with the cigar. Obviously, not a scenario that happens in most offices. But that led to a big discussion about what if thinking. So we preempted Mark Twain before we got there anyway. And then we moved on to the snowball, and there was the tumbleweed moment of nobody wanting to give an example. So I did a semi-true and a semi-remembered story about losing the keys to my vehicle and being concerned about not being able to get to work and that type of thing. And then that unleashed, no pun intended, an avalanche of other storytelling from people. So that was quite a useful thing about sharing your own personal anecdote and the kind of coming alongside the group and that freeing them up to speak a bit more about their own experiences.
Yeah, that's really good to hear because we talk about that as well, don't we, on training about getting the balance of that right. But I have always found it to be helpful to sometimes share, just to give an example, and then that gets the rest of the group going. So that's really lovely to hear it happen there.
And then the image of the two characters being chased down by the snowball caused a giggle, but also quite a lot of recognition amongst them. Oh, yeah. And then they did get them. They'd never heard of Mark Twain, so that was interesting. But the quote resonated. But then I think there's a tricky balance there about some worries do occur in life. But then whether they are as big as we expect them to be when they happen is a different discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that we say on training to people is about, obviously, in your context, you know the pastoral system because you're part of it. But if external teachers are going in, just making sure that people know what that is and signposting for children who feel they've got worries that they do want to talk to an adult about. It's important, isn't it, to just identify on that.
And I think I'd add on to that it probably does come in more if you're external or if you're working with a class that isn't your own, is having that time to talk back to teachers and significant adults about what's come up. So certainly these more recent lessons, as in these two, have brought up some stuff that is not in any massive concerning way, but just some general stuff that's been well worth other adults who work with those children knowing about it. dialogue is very important.
Yeah.
That being able to speak to other professionals.
Absolutely. I'm glad to hear in a way that that's happened, because
Yeah,
sometimes you think what would release that, in terms of children
yeah, and I think
sharing or adults knowing about what's going on with children.
there's something around the progression of Pause B which allows a safer space for that. And I'm not talking about sharing massive worries, but that kind of self-realization in children feeling that it is okay to talk about worries. As adult human beings, how many of us are more reluctant to share our feelings and intimate thoughts with other people?
Yeah. So important to just know, give permission for that. And this lesson really does free that up, doesn't it? Of just thinking you're not on your own, but the people are in the room also worry about things.
Yeah. And hats off to Sarah and Tabs and the others who created the initial version of this, because it's very well thought out. Just if one more thing, I take the Pause B toolkit and would try and spend a bit of time on just bringing out the key aspects of each practice in which they're naturally more drawn towards, which this time round was finger breathing and petal practice, which are quite normal for those of us that have taught this a lot of times.
Yeah, it's a good kind of little check-in, actually, isn't it? To just find out what's really like the ones that they really want to try out or use.
Whilst also being able to say that it's okay if this isn't for you.
Yeah, exactly that. And I always think maybe not right now, but maybe you try this in 6 months or you try it in a
Yeah,
year
yeah.
and it feel different. So just offering that opportunity as well for it to be something they come back to at some point.
Yeah,
And they
definitely.
know about it now. Yeah. So moving into lesson 10 then, you were sharing before that sometimes you have to do a bit of pre-learning with this.
Yeah, this one, it started with that. I wonder who's actually flown a kite, which I didn't say out loud, but we had a pretty interesting discussion around kites. And actually, some of the analogies they're coming up with were much better than the ones written down in the booklet. Although that, like, largely by and by. But as soon as we got to Scooby Doo, it was very apparent that not everybody in the class had the pleasure of being familiar with Scooby Doo. So I did make the decision on this one to come out of the PowerPoint and go into YouTube. Did something I probably wouldn't recommend, which was picking a random video without checking it first, but actually it was fine. So that was quite useful, and also set up a lot of the discussions around misinterpreting what's actually going on, and they were able to make links back to the kind of amygdala lessons and fight, flight, freeze quite quickly. So actually, in terms of upping the energy level of the group and the level of interest, it worked quite well. That wasn't like a really prepared thing. That was okay. They're not. This isn't going to make much sense without at least watching a little bit for some of the class. So yeah, pulled it up. They wanted to watch the full hour of the clip compendium. We did boundary it to about 3 minutes.
And so that then helped with them understanding, or because just to give context for this, it just pulls out all of that stuff about jumping to conclusions as well.
Yeah, it does. And about reactivity, comfort eating comes out of that.
But you said it was really different with the other clip that's in this.
Yeah, the other bit that comes out of Scooby Doo is that they must have their hippocampuses or hippocampi, however you say the plural, must be faulty. So they never linked this back. But yeah, then as soon as Captain Hook came up, a couple of the children virtually did the whole clip before I showed it, and I hadn't told them which clip it was going to be. So that was interesting. So yeah, they accessed that one really quickly, and it came out of naturally discussion about that. Actually, Hook's reactivity was being triggered by remembering, and not that there was a genuine threat there. Perfectly understandable if a crocodile has chewed your hand off and followed your wristwatch. You might be a little bit wary of that. But they picked up, and also from a health and safety point of view, hanging your leg over a boat to kick away a crocodile probably isn't the best plan. But
Yeah.
they were able to link that actually there wasn't a genuine threat in that particular moment, but in the act of remembering, they can kick off that reactivity and that propulsion into, well, in Hook's case, freezing and then running away, and then very heroically pushing Smee in front of him as a human body shield. So it was interesting, but we went through that reasonably quickly this time.
Yeah.
And
Following on from that, we have the hot cross bun scenario. And I just wonder if you were saying before about the fact that with the age range of these children, that maybe.
yeah, I think on one hand, it's the first time that we come across it.
Mm.
I've even got written in my own notes from trainer days might not be suitable for younger children. So that's played out in experience. I think they struggle generally on that first meeting, and not to name things, but to, and I guess in some ways it is an artificial separation of experience, but to segment into those 4 different experiences becomes quite problematic. And particularly if you're naming body sensations, is often renaming the emotion that's been mentioned before.
Yeah, we're both adult mindfulness teachers as well as teachers of young people. And I have that experience when adults are first introduced to this idea of pulling everything out in that way. So I'm not surprised children do as well.
I think children over time, I can't remember how long I've been teaching Paws B, but it's over a decade. That children now seem to have more words to describe things emotionally than previously. I think what children probably still struggle with is the same with adults, is actually being able to name how that shows up in the body.
Yeah,
Unless it's really strong.
Yeah, that connection. And so you begin to tiptoe into that, don't you, in lesson 6 and then into lesson 7 and 8. And so then you're trying to reinforce that connection of feelings show up for us physically. Yeah. It is still so new as an idea, this kind of connection between emotions, how they show up in the body, and not just being a kind of mind thing.
Yeah. And that's like that horticultural time of the seed sowing. You know, I mean, even how often in 8-week courses do things not make sense until months afterwards?
Absolutely. And there is just that idea of the fact that you will have opportunity to revisit this, of course, with them at some point. And there might be times where even just pulling up the diagram can just be helpful for pulling out something that's there in a moment. I sometimes think about children arguing on the playground, for example. What's actually going on here? And really important to just have that awareness of how you're reacting to something.
Yeah, and I had that this way, actually offshoot this in the playground with somebody who'd had a confrontation, I think largely in their own head, if I'm being honest, during a PE session or a game of netball, and got quite upset, which is a pattern of reactivity that I've seen. And it was interesting to say, what's going on for you now? What's here right now? Is there anywhere we can drop our attention into just to help things to calm a bit? And not with the intention of being calm, but more that snow globe settling. And that was interesting because that's the first moment probably with that class that I've been able to explicitly link some of the learning from Paws B to an actual real life scenario. And what was interesting was you could actually see him drop a bit. That whooshed upness of upsetness to just begin to settle like the flakes in a snow globe. And that's the power of this, I think, particularly if you're in either the teacher or you're in the school or there's other adults around, so it is culturally becoming more a part of the school, that opportunity just to drop moments of learning in elsewhere.
Yeah, I love hearing about that. That's what you would hope, really, isn't it? Is that
it's the same as in your own practice, noticing the moments go, okay, I've done something differently this time. I've noticed that the chaotic way that the dishwasher is stacked at home really isn't the end of the world. And I probably don't need to make comment on it. Or if I'm going to, I should probably do it in a structured, thought out manner rather than just going, ah! Yeah, so can we spot? Cause I do think with mindfulness, however we define it, there's a greater awareness of things for us that brings greater choice.
Absolutely. And I can remember, and I hope you don't mind me sharing this, that you shared once with me that it also helps you recover quicker when things do kick off. So even when you do have the reaction, you're able to recover more quickly.
Yeah, which I think that's really relevant to these lessons about storytelling mind thought, is how often do we reactivate things for ourselves by thinking it over. And I think that blog that I wrote about good enough is still there on the internet, but good enough is good enough. And let's be kind to ourselves if things have got a bit wrong. Mindfulness practice can help with that, I think. As can other things. Putting on really loud music is still one of my ways of giving myself some space.
Yeah.
We're up to MiYO, and I think that again felt reasonably quick. That is one you can spend ages on. We had a whole side discussion around what was the difference between the top and bottom picture and who was MiYO. Even though I was saying, well, I suppose MiYO could be the person talking in either picture. But the bit that really came out quite strongly this time was how as it often does, I think, is how quickly we go to a negative interpretation. But whether that then manifests itself in wanting to cry or wanting to run away or wanting to go over and do something unkind to Mo, it was all generally negative. And then there was some real like, oh, wow, when we was like, oh, maybe Mo's just sharing a joke that you shared with Mo. So that was interesting in terms of that sense of negativity bias, that it was there, even working with years 3, 4, and 5.
Oh, yeah. And good for them to just recognise A, that's normal,
Yeah.
and B, that we can learn to spot it a little bit
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah. And again, I think that reinforces the filling in the gaps and coming up with a narrative that maybe feels a bit more familiar. I spoke earlier about where I catch up time, and the next 4 slides are where I catch up time for myself. So I go through the worrying, your mind tells you something scary type situation. We did talk with a really light touch around what might you be worrying about, but again, with awareness of the class, that was quite quick. Sometimes I've done that in far more depth, particularly if there's something very live. If that had been a solo year 6 class, SATs probably would have come up.
Yeah.
Because of the culture of the school that I work in, SATs really aren't very threatening to children, so there's less of that anyway, the natural part of the school. And we talked a little bit about how worry shows up in the body. That's something I'd like to come back to at some point. And then I tend to pick up time on overthinking, getting tied up, and the kite slide. So that again, I went through those reasonably, but I was trying to reinforce, particularly on the tied up slide, that if we can notice something that's going on right now for ourselves, it might stop some of that entanglement. It was derailed slightly, as it has been before, by people talking about their own cats/kittens and getting embroiled in wool and whatnot. But I went through those reasonably quickly, as I often do, to get to the petal practice. That was probably an in-betweeny amount of time this time round. Interestingly, from that came up a discussion like from before about which way the hand movement goes, a few more about do I need to move my hand, and then we did discuss a little bit more about the kind of physiological aspects of lengthening the out breath compared to the in breath and re-engaging the parasympathetic nervous system, whilst having a discussion for those from, again, for whom breath probably isn't their most welcome bit. So it was useful, the discussion that came out of that. Yeah. It wasn't so much inquiring into direct experiences, inquiring into what this might mean for us and how does it work and what can we do and what do we like and what's useful for us.
And as you mentioned before, from the end of the previous lesson, they'd said that petal practice was one that they enjoyed.
Yeah, so it made a lot of sense. And actually, it was interesting watching them drop more quickly into practice. I'm not going to say it's the whole class, because some of the class were a bit more of a whirlwind of activity, but probably particularly for the older end of that class, so the 4s and 5s that were with me, the dropping was quicker. And actually, I had so often with this, for those children who I would say might benefit from this most, were probably those who were most committed to giving the practice a good go.
And I know that we will have named this before and other things, but just to say that there isn't an expectation that every single child is going to engage in the way that you would want them to. It's really normal that you have children who don't, and you just find ways of keeping them included without putting too much pressure on them either to behave in the way that the older children do.
Yeah. And just saying, look, it's up to you if you want to join in, but please can you be respectful of other people who do want to. So if you just want to take 5 minutes of completely vaguing out, that's completely up to you.
Yeah, absolutely.
But let's do it without playing like air trumpet or something in between. Not that that happened. In fact, I'm probably more likely to do that myself, but that ended things.
So then we have the storytelling not necessarily being a difficult thing, which comes up with the...
Yeah. So what was interesting there, having intended before I left Miss to replace that slide with one of the library that is probably in the Dropbox folder somewhere, to show those 3 authors that are currently there, perhaps who have some controversy around them, to say the least, was actually how familiar those books were, how enjoyed the stories still were, and therefore it really resonated with the usefulness of storytelling and creativity in that sense. So I do think it's worth really making it explicit at that point that although we've spoken about storytelling mind, that's not necessarily a problem.
Yeah, absolutely.
just a problem when we're doing it at 3 o'clock in the morning when we'd rather be asleep.
Yeah. And then we come to what is one of my favourite bits of that lesson, which is the kind of magic images, as it were, in the sense that their initial perspective on what they can see then changes with time, and they can see different things in the images.
Yeah, and I think it really introduces a kind of a greater sense of playfulness, perhaps after what can feel like a reasonably serious session in some ways. And that real aha moment when you, particularly if you're stuck on seeing the other thing than the thing you can currently see, is just that kind of joy of how resistant the mind is. And then, whoa, yeah, and then that playing between two things. And I love this with a group of children and with adults, actually. That whole no, they're not there. There's no old woman. What are you talking about? So it brings a certain joy and playfulness. And then the next image of the two old people or the two people with instruments and things, they just saw loads. And then I must admit, we quickly went through the kind of recap of the session and the practices, and then brought up a lot of other images on the internet, finding some of the classic ones, but just that kind of playful joy and interest of, oh yeah, our minds really do tend to not want to move from the things that we first decided are true. And then that flexibility. So again, being able to move perspectives, but you could feel the energy level go up in the room. Which was a great thing to be able to see.
As you're describing it, I'm actually remembering my Pawsby training and when I first saw these and how it was in the room, because I can actually remember that kind of interest that was there and everybody being really curious to see what they could see.
Yeah, that's such a key part of mindfulness, isn't it? That curiosity in our own experience.
Yeah.
And if you're genuinely curious, it does take out some of the heat out of it.
Yeah.
Particularly when we act in quite bizarre ways. So ability to play with and laugh about things is quite important, I think.
Yeah, definitely. Well, just want to say thank you so much for joining me for this video and for talking about these two lessons, but also just generally, Ben, for all of your work that you've done for MISP. I think you've done a huge amount to be an advocate and ambassador for this work. And it's just really lovely, actually, to hear about you teaching Pawsby again with groups of children in school. So thank you.
No, thank you. And as I shared via a couple of messages when I was doing it, it's a real joy to actually be teaching these materials out with children again in a real setting and see what happens, and perhaps with a greater sense of playfulness. And I do think that's important.
Absolutely. And here's hoping that's what people are getting from these videos, is an encouragement to do that.
It helps when you become a trainer for MISP, because when you become a lead trainer, you've got the editable PowerPoints anyway. So there's permission to adapt. But I'd still echo that initial advice of probably teach it largely the way it's written. And also, having taught a lot of children over a long period of time, you can never be 100% sure what's going to resonate with any year group. So being prepared to pivot and improvise. And if you're not in the situation of having a slightly flexible timetable, which it was when I was delivering these sessions, then being okay with coming back to it later on. This isn't like a finish and tick thing, it's a journeying over time. And then the same with these children, I will probably teaching in its entirety again next year just to see what happens. So those younger children have got a bit older. But then we've also got Dot Breathe, which I think is quite a pertinent add-on with year sixes. And if your Dot's trained, we were having a discussion before this about what that might look like in year three. So I'm generating a lot of ideas of what could be tweaked about a lot of these things on reflection now. So yeah, play around with it, have fun, treat it lightly, but even through that lightness and playfulness, there can be a huge power to all of this.
Oh, thank you. That feels like a nice way to end this session.
Yeah.
Appreciate it, Ben. Thank you.
No, likewise, great to talk.